My name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's user share with Mike Nelson. He is going to be talking about managing Azure for Citrix admins, which I know is a big topic out there. Just really quickly, a little housekeeping. We are recording today's session, so you will receive a link to the recording in email sometime tomorrow. And also, we'd love to have you type your questions into the question panel. Mike's going to do his best to get to those questions throughout the presentation. So just type them in there, and we'll keep an eye on them and get to them as best we can. And with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to you, Mike, to get us started.
Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be, and happy Thursday. One more day to the holiday, one more day to the weekend, I should say, which is great. Again, my name is Mike Nelson, as Stephanie mentioned. I'd like to take this minute here for a second, though, and thank Stephanie for everything that she does for CUGC. She's awesome, and to thank her for letting me put this little shindig on today. She mentioned I don't have a moderator today, so I'm going to be kind of doing this myself, but we'll see how it goes, and we'll watch the questions and go from there.
And I'll be here to help you.
Oh, you always are. I appreciate that. My name is Mike Nelson. I am a cloud architect with a company called Zerto. We do disaster recovery as a service, DR, and also in-house disaster recovery. But I am a Citrix CTP since 2013. I'm a member of the CUGC Content Committee, which I work closely with Stephanie with. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center. And that kind of segues into why I'm giving this presentation. I'm a Microsoft Azure advisor and a VMware vExpert. You can always catch me on Twitter @NelMedia. I don't really have a blog. I never really got into the whole blogging thing, but I'm really active on all the social medias, the Twitter, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. So if you ever need to get a hold of me, that's how you do it. So what we're here to talk about is we're here to talk about managing the Citrix infrastructure on Azure. Now, what I put into the actual abstract of the session was around, you know, some Citrix administrators have never really gone to the cloud. They haven't done anything with Azure. And Citrix came out and said, oh, we're all in with the cloud. You know, it's the cloud or nothing. We're going to start kind of taking people off premises and trying to get them to go to the cloud. Well, for some Citrix administrator, that's really kind of a scary thought because, like I said, they've never touched the cloud or they've touched it very little. And now they've kind of been, you know, given this task. Their boss walks in and says, hey, we're going to the Citrix cloud and you guys got to manage it. And you're like, oh, great, thank you very much. Just go ahead and drop that on the other pile on the corner of my desk. It's happening. I've talked to some administrators that are just they're like, I've got to learn something new again. I've got to start all over. For those places that are fortunate enough to have the larger enterprise with the actual cloud administrator. Okay, so there's the new cloud administrators popping up now. There's a new cloud architect titles popping up now. If you're lucky enough to have those, that's awesome. But if you're not, it can be a little daunting, right? Azure in itself can be daunting. If you've worked with other cloud providers like Azure or AWS, AWS or Google Cloud, then you kind of have an idea of how this all works. Okay, so it doesn't work exactly the same, but you kind of have an idea. So what I liken this to is, this is kind of a cool picture of dolphins, right? But how many people out there actually know that dolphins can multitask? And by that, I mean dolphins can actually carry on 2 conversations at one time. They have 2 sets of vocal cords. So they can talk at the same time with 2 different dolphins, okay, having a conversation with both of them, which I think is just amazing. But from a human aspect, can we really do that? When you're an administrator, can you really sit there and multitask like that? I know a lot of people try to do it. Some people are really, really good at it, but some people are really, really bad at it, like myself. But you know, you've got to try and coordinate all this stuff and figure out how you're going to work with it and how you're going to administrate it and how you're going to manage it and what happens when it breaks and these developers want to get up there now and do their thing, and it kind of just like all over the board. It kind of freaks you out a little bit. So we've got to actually start getting into the groove if you're, covering all this by yourself, of being able to manage this easy. We're trying to make this easier for you. Okay, so first of all, let's go over something about the topics we're going to cover. The first one we're going to cover is actually XAE, XDE, XenApp Essentials, and Desktop Essentials, and Azure. We're then going to go over to the key Azure concepts, okay, the portal and PowerShell, and then also the last thing is Azure Services and Tools. Now, Azure Services and Tools, I'm going to cover a whole bunch of stuff, so this deck is not going to be heavy. I mean, we're going to fly through these slides, and I've got a whole bunch of other things that I have to show you outside of this deck. All right. Now, some folks are going to sit there and go, "Oh man, he's going to cover this, that second line, key Azure concepts. What does that usually mean?" He's going to go into the meat and potatoes and, get into the boring stuff. Not really. And the reason for that is because earlier in July of this year, you had an awesome presentation by Mr. Mario Senbu and Dave Brett, delivering and optimizing Citrix from Microsoft Azure. They did a great job at a CUGC user share that happened back in July. You can go to CUGC, my CUGC, and view it, listen to it, get the deck. It was a great presentation. It really was, and that gets into a lot of the details, the gory details of some of the things that are going underneath the covers when you're dealing with Citrix and Azure. I'm not going to get into those. Okay, this is an administration thing. This is the guy on the front line, the girl on the front lines that is taking care of managing Citrix. So everybody knows what this looks like, right? XenApp Essentials. This is the architecture that basically is covered in Azure. You have your on-premise, okay, dealing with anything you deal with on-premise, with the NetScaler Gateway Service, Delivery Controller, Storefront, which is kind of there right now. But then everything over here is in Azure, okay? The app workloads, the servers, the images, all that for XenApp is located inside of Azure. That's a lot of stuff. It really is. And that's a lot of stuff to take care of and watch and monitor. Now, I know that Citrix Cloud does some of this for us. It does a great job of telling us some information about what's going on up there and so on and so forth, because it is the control plane. But it doesn't go as far as it could. There are some other things that I think that Azure brings to the table that make this a lot more interesting, and we'll get to that. Next off, we're going to look at XDE. XDE is basically the same principle. You're just changing the components that are involved, right? So back inside of the bubble of Azure, you're dealing with the actual desktops, the desktop workloads rather than the XenApp workloads. You're still dealing with master images. You're still dealing with, on the other side, you've got a new one up there called Studio, as you know. So if you've deployed this or you've looked at this or you've heard the spiel on Citrix Cloud, then you've seen this or you know what this looks like. What happens when you actually bring the on-premises component to it, though? When you bring the on-premises component to it, though, you have the workspace cloud, okay, which is, of course, operated by Citrix, and then you have the customer partner managed, all right, which is the hypervisor, is the gateway, the Active Directory, everything. Now, that could be on-premises or cloud, as you see in the middle there, okay? But when you actually start combining them and add another component to it, this is where you get, okay, you got the cloud, now you're going to add on-prem data center, and you're going to add the Citrix Cloud control plane. Okay, so this can get kind of complicated because you're trying to monitor and manage and administrate everything on your on-prem data center, and you're going to try and do the same thing in the cloud. All right, so you bring down and you say, okay, well, Citrix, take care of all this for me. You can do, like I said, some of it, but I'm going to show you some other things that I think you'll find very interesting. So when we talk about Azure, all right, there are some very basic things that you have to do with Azure, all right? And these basic things are what makes your experience. So when you sign up and you go out and you get a subscription, okay, there are specific things that have to happen in order for you to be able to use the functionality of Azure at an enterprise level. The first thing is connectivity, okay? You have to have some way to connect to it. There has to be a direct internet connection, there has to be a site-to-site VPN, express route, if you're not familiar with that is, that's actually a direct connection, redundant connection through a service provider that is approved by Microsoft. And then there's also SD-WAN. Now, SD-WAN is kind of like, you know, kind of newer, but I will tell you this much, coming up in the future, SD-WAN will play a big, big part in some of the offerings that are going to be coming from the Azure Marketplace. Okay, so that's from the connectivity standpoint. Then you have subscription. You can't really use Azure unless you have a subscription. Okay, so to get a subscription, you create it and you're considered what they call a tenant. All right, you're a tenant inside of Azure. Now, if you go through what they call a cloud service provider or a Microsoft service provider, a CSP or an MSP, then you are actually a tenant of that CSP or MSP. I don't know what your situation is. You could have, you know, you could be a tenant of you know, XYZ cloud provider that actually hosts all the stuff in Azure. I don't know that. But somehow you have to get that to become a tenant. You can also do this through what they call enterprise agreement, EAs, right? So when you get an EA, you can actually get Azure credits. You can go through an EA agreement, and then you get access to what's called the Azure EA portal, which is a different portal than Azure that allows you to assign subscriptions to users and administrate them and create accounting and be able to pull usage information, all that kind of good stuff. The CSPs also have that ability as well. And then there's something you have to know about the limits of your subscriptions, okay, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But everybody's not, you know, is not particularly aware that, hey, I can go out and create all this stuff. All right, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to create 10 different instances of Zen App Essentials or Zen Desktop Essentials. Well, there are limits in each subscription, okay, and those limits could hinder you in your optimism to make that deployment. All right, so I'll talk about those in a little bit. Then you have to manage it. A couple different ways to manage it is via the portal, the Azure portal. You have the RESTful APIs, which includes PowerShell. All right, there's some other APIs as well, the Azure CLI, and the other one is Visual Studio, which is your development environment, right? So you can actually manage Azure through Visual Studio. It's got all the tools and everything that you can integrate into Visual Studio now. It's really kind of cool. Once you're in there, you actually create resources, right? And resources are created inside of something they call Azure Resource Manager, ARM, okay? And that covers the provisioning of your resources, of your objects, the orchestration, how they, how they're connected to each other, what, where they go to, what they talk to, and then lifecycle, how long they exist, how they get updated, so on and so forth. The presentation that I talked about that happened back in June with Marius and Dave, I highly recommend. They went into this really well. So if you want more information on that, please consult that. I'm not going to get into that too heavily. And then we have resource groups, which are just basically logical groupings of items that need to work together. When you go out and you create an XAE or an XDE environment, it creates a logical grouping or a resource group that all of those components are held together. And the reason is because it's like a container for, hey, you put all your papers in a folder for my taxes. They all go into the same folder because they're all for the same year. You're going to do the same thing with that, consider that where you put that Citrix environment into a folder, because they all need to stay together and they all need to be together when you turn it over to the IRS fraud or whatever. hopefully you don't get audited. And it also has RBAC, which is the actual role-based access control, which some of you are probably familiar with when you start getting into, who has access to what, who can control what, so on and so forth. And then the final one is Active Directory. Active Directory kind of still, hangs around and rules everything up in Azure. It contains everything for identity management and covers everything from users, groups, devices, etc. It's still a very much a key component of the Citrix deployment that happens in Azure, as well as many, many other things that you'll be, hopefully be doing in Azure, or any cloud service for that matter. As other cloud services, obviously, you can use LDAP or, stand up your own AD and things like that. But Active Directory is kind of native to Azure, which is really cool, and we'll get into that. So, real brief, the Azure Resource Manager, Lifecycle container, declarative solution for deployment and configuration, and is a consistent management layer, okay? That's really key, because what used to be, okay, is something called ASM. I don't know if anybody's familiar with ASM. Excuse me, I'm sorry, which is a service, the old service management. When you go in and people talk about the classic portal in Azure, that's actually ASM. And that is actually based off of something called RDFE, all right? And that stands for Red Dog Front End. If you don't know the history of Azure, I've spoken about this many times, but Azure actually had the code name of Red Dog a long time ago. And Red Dog, there was a Red Dog OS, which actually was the start of the hypervisor OS that's used in Azure. And they had the Red Dog Front End, which was the initial front end for Azure. It didn't look like what the classic portal looks like, obviously, but it's like version 2 of RDFE. So that is actually going away. Microsoft has actually said, hey, this is going away, this is legacy, we're going to start fading this stuff out. So if you have things that are in the classic portal, okay, those are going to be, eventually phased out because more things are being added into the ARM, into the resource manager. So they're even saying, they're putting the end of life on some of the stuff in the ASM. So really, it's something that I'll show you here in a second, but it's really going to be beneficial to everyone. Some people complained about it initially, but it really does make life easier. Then we have the resource groups, which I talked about, right? Everything is coupled, containers, multiple resources, different resource types. Resource groups can span regions. Okay, if you understand regions in Azure you have regions. So say I have a region that's called, where I live, North Central US. All right, so you think of regions, the first thing that pops in your mind that I talk to people about, they say, oh, that you mean you have a data center there. Well, a region is actually made up of multiple data centers. Okay, so North Central US, there's actually there's going to be 5 data centers located in North Central US here pretty soon. And that makes up a region, all right? When you put an application in a resource group into that region, okay, that application spans the entire region. It actually gets populated throughout all the data centers in that region because they all share a common fabric on the back end. All right, now you can actually take that and say I have another region in the US East which contains like 10 data centers. Now I can actually take that group and span it across. What does that do? That allows me to have redundancy, allows me to have resiliency in multiple geographical regions, which is really important for recovery and for continuity. All right. Now the resource group is a unit of management. It has a lifecycle, identity, and grouping. Everything, the big thing in here is, deployment, update, delete, and status on the lifecycle is really important because you can actually take that whole grouping and say, I want to update it all at once, or I want a rolling update, or whatever. You try and make yourself more flexible. You try and make yourself, have the ability to manage it in such a way that you used to doing with your on-premises. Okay. because some people, they're like, hey, I've been doing this for years on-prem. Why can't I do this, up in the cloud? Well, you can. Okay, so this is these are all last couple of slides have been Microsoft slides. But this is really a cool one. The question is, should these resources be in the same group or a different one? If you take a look at these, okay, so if you have a resource group, okay, with the web, DB, VM, and storage in one group, or should they be in separate ones? And they're just linked together. See the links in between? All right. Actually, the hint is, what do they have in common from lifecycle and management? Do they have anything in common from a lifecycle? Does your web, okay, application rely on your DB version, and your VM can't be updated unless your DB version is at a certain level, and your storage can't change, and blah, 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 so on and so forth? Okay, that's the answer. It's up to you. It all depends on what you're putting up there. Okay, does it have to be in the same group? No. An application doesn't have, you can have an app in one resource group that's residing over in China and have the database server in another resource group that resides over on West US. Why you would want to do that, I don't know, but you may have your reasons, all right? But it's very, very doable. With that, you have the power of repeatability, okay? So we talk about something called Azure templates, which I'm going to show you. And they go to a templating type of thing, and as you know, if you dealt with any other types of applications that use templating, that the ability to clone, the ability to, these are all key buzzwords that you can kind of grasp onto. With Azure, it's templating, and that allows you to create something and then just reuse that template, okay? It's a repeatable configuration, okay? So you allow for, like it says here, the simplify orchestration, rollback, all that kind of stuff. Templates can, are source file, they're checked in, they actually have a built-in source versioning repository, all right? They have parameters that go with them. You can, create your own templates that allow you to put in custom parameters, all that kind of cool stuff, all right? So as an administrator, when you go out there and you want to create a VM and you want to create it for XYZ app, and you want the ability to go out there and throw 5 more machines out there in case, you need to scale up or something like that, you can have a template that automatically deploys those machines. Now, there's another thing that you can do as well. See, you can also do something called scale up sets. So in Azure, you can actually have that machine templated, and then Azure will automatically scale it up and scale it back depending on the demand thresholds that you set on that machine. Really cool stuff. I'm not going to get into that right now, but that's really cool stuff. This is the picture of the difference between ASM and ARM, what I was kind of getting at. When you talk about the ASM, the legacy mode, notice how everything is separate. In order to get things to talk to each other, you had to create virtual nets, VPCs, VNets, and things like that in order to have them talk to each other. You had to make sure that boundaries were crossed and that the security groups were okay, and blah, 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 blah. With ARM, everything just kind of talks to each other, and everything's, cool with being in the same group, and you can still have those barriers there, but you don't have to really. It just makes things a lot easier. Okay, so you want to go out and create a VM. There are a lot of ways to do it. So as an administrator, you can create a VM from the portal. You can do it from PowerShell. You can do it from this Azure CLI, which is the command line interpreter. All right, now I'm going to stop right here for a second. What is the difference between PowerShell and Azure CLI? They're both command line, right? Well, PowerShell obviously is a scripting engine, right? It's not a scripting language. Don't call it a scripting language. It's not. It's a scripting engine, okay? PowerShell is a scripting engine. Azure CLI is a cross-platform command line interpreter. So you have the ability to take Azure CLI and it can ride on, multiple different platforms. PowerShell isn't there yet. It can't do all the different platforms that Azure CLI can. And Azure CLI has a little bit more flexibility, okay? They're both being developed side by side, and they're both being developed openly on GitHub. All right, so these are things that, you know, they're going to remain the two primary non-GUI components of management for Azure. Then you have the the ARM and ASM template. ASM not so much anymore, like I mentioned, mainly ARM. The REST API, which can include things outside of PowerShell and Azure CLI, like I talked about, the Visual Studio, the C#, JSON, all that kind of good stuff. The Visual Studio SDK, SCCM app controller, if any of you guys use SCCM. Okay, you can control and create VMs and destroy them and stop and start and restart everything through the app controller. And then there's also some third-party products that'll do it as well. If you haven't looked, there's a company out there called Five9. Five9 actually, you know, will the management tool for Azure, or actually Hyper-V, will go out and create VMs in Azure for you. So when you go out and create a VM, you have to look at the size. This is really big because as an administrator, it's kind of like, you know, you go into your data center and you're like, oh God, I need more hardware, right? So I just go out and buy another Dell or an HP or a Supermicro or whatever, and I know the specs, and I just, you know, pop it in and we're ready to go. Or if you're building VMs, you're like, oh yeah, I know the size this has got to be. You know, I don't have any real set. I just give this one 2 CPUs. I give this one 4. I give this one 8 gigs of RAM. I get this one 16 gigs of RAM, so on and so forth. Well, in the cloud, it's a little bit different. Okay, in the cloud, you actually have to go by the sizes that you're allowed to use, and there are a lot of them, a lot. Okay, and there are some variables within the sizes themselves, but these are generally the ones that you can use. Now, there's a couple more that have been added since this slide, so it's not entirely up to date. But you know, excuse me, there are a lot of that can be added, and that will be added, but you're really kind of confined to what you can do here. All right, you really have to understand that, yeah, it was really easy to do this before in my on-premises environment. When you get up to the cloud, it's not something you can just go in and click and change. Okay, so I'll just take a brief look at like the A0, A5 basic, right? That's 1 to 8 cores, you know, 0.75 to 14 gigs of RAM. It's an entry-level, economical, good for dev workloads, dev test type of deal. Everything that I build for dev tests is an A0 to an A5. Okay, now you go in there, when you create it, you tell them how much RAM and all that other kind of stuff, but you don't have the control like you have on-prem. Okay, you don't have that control. You pretty much, you know, you have to use what you're given. That's what, you know, IaaS is all about. So when you look at disks, all right, when you look at disks, there's standard storage, all right, which is cloud scale, maximum 500 IOPS, 60 megabits per second throughput, and it's available on everything. Then you have premium storage, which is high performance, low latency, 5,000 IOPS, 200 megabit per second, okay, only supported in S series, all right, and it's locally redundant storage only. It can't go geo-redundant. It can't be redundant across geography, okay, or multiple regions. All right, that's kind of like the middle tier. And then you got the actual Azure file storage, which is mainly just for files. All right, it mounts as, you know, you can mount it as a network share volume as an NFS. You can access it through SMB or REST API, 1,000 IOPS, up to 60 megabit, and then you have a max share size. You can have a 5 terabyte of shares. So if smaller companies, if you guys have like user directories and you're like, wow, we got to get these user directories out of here off of on-prem, and they're only like 2 or 3 terabytes in size, you can go up and just throw them right into Azure File Storage. Now, I'm not saying to do that. It all depends on your situation, but you might have that option to do that. You know, it might work for you. Notice that also on the premium storage, you're getting an SSD disk, right? You have the option when you go create a machine to specify, you know, regular HDD or SSD disks. Then we get into disks and images, right? Because you have OS images, which are created by Microsoft or by, you know, CentOS. You know, all the other ones are all created by whoever partner, you know. And then you actually have users that create their own stuff. All right. That's the base image, a sysprep, generalized read-only, created by uploading or by a capture. And then you have the disks. That's the actual, the virtual logical disks that reside for the VMs. Now, they brought in something called managed disks, which, is a little bit different. Okay, because you usually just have regular disks, but now you can bring in managed disks. Those are disks that you can actually bring up from your environment, and have them managed by Azure. And I won't get into that because that's another conversation, but it's something you need to understand. It's something you need to know and look into if you're interested in that. They just brought it into Azure not too long ago. So, virtual networks, bring your own network. Okay, that is, if you connect, you can bring your own network. You can actually create that VPN tunnel or express route or SD-WAN, however you want to do it, and you can bring your own network. Okay, you can you extend your IP scheme and bring your DNS into it, all that kind of stuff. You define your own subnets. You can do peering with other VNets. So you create a VNet for XYZ app, and then you create a VNet for your user authentication or whatever have you. You can have those peered, so the VNets can talk to each other, all right? And they talk to each other directly via the IP addresses, all right? VNets can define what they call NSGs, which are network security groups, okay, which basically sets ACL rules for a VNet. All right, and NSGs can be associated with subnets or individual VM instances. You can have an NSG that just applies to one VM, or you can have it apply to an entire subnet. Networking can get pretty complicated. I'm not a networking guy. I never started out at networking. If I probably would have started my career in networking, I'd be better at it. But I kind of rely more on the folks that are really smart about that stuff. And I came from a generalization background, a general administration background. So this is really helpful to me to understand this and be able to look at what other people are doing and how this is all architected. Now, one thing I do want to note on this slide is that you'll notice that they have a public-facing load balancer and an internal load balancer. Those load balancers are required by Microsoft. All right, so those are things that are going to go in, and whatever your deployment is, they require an actual load balancer to go in for certain applications in a marketplace app or in a deployment. And a lot of that stuff, is because that's basically handles some of the firewalling features and the redundancy and so on and so forth. One of the biggest things I have to tell you about using Azure, though, is you need to control your spend. All right, there is a pricing calculator out there. I don't have a lot of faith in pricing calculators, but they do have one out there. But the big thing to remember here is that different regions have different prices. And there's a gentleman named Chris Pitchman. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he does something called the buildazure.com, which he does the Azure Weekly, and he's an MVP for Azure. But he has a website that actually shows you, the different regions and different prices that could be involved there. And this is just an example of one of them. If I were to build a DS1, DS2, or a DS11 in a South Central U.S. region, it would cost me, $47, $94, $123, all right, a month. But look, if I did it in West U.S., it's cheaper. All right, so if I do this for North Central is actually a little bit more expensive. And I don't know how they base this, if it's based off of how much resources they have in a region or whatever, but you have to understand when you go and you just select a region to put your VMs into, the price will be different. So if you go say something like, oh, I built this out in Azure and I built it in US West and it's costing us $500 a month in compute resources, storage resources, so on. Okay, then they come back to you and say, hey, we want you to do the same thing. We want you to take that and we want you to lift it and we want you to put it over on the East Coast as well. And you're going to say, okay, yeah, that'll cost $500 a month. Not so fast. Okay, make sure it costs the same amount. I bet you it doesn't. All right, because you may pay $500 on the West Coast and you're going to pay $600 on the East Coast. Who knows? Now, this is the other part I talked about before. Be aware of your limits. This is, advertised on Microsoft Azure site. But if you get a subscription, you can only have 20 cores. All right, 20 cores, that's it. Okay, you can only have 20 VMs per subscription and Resource Manager, 20 per region. Okay, if you look at all these, some of these seem really limiting. They really do. But the key thing to remember here is that you can always ask for a subscription exception. You can always go out and say, I need more resources. You can, there's actually a link, okay, inside the Azure portal when you're working in there, and if you come up with an error message that says you know subscription is out of cores, or you can, I'll show you where you can actually look, and it'll tell you how many cores you're using and all the other resources that you're using. You can actually click on it, it'll send open up a support ticket, and that's in that support ticket you're just saying, can you please give me more cores? Can you please give me more whatever resources so I can do this? Now, Microsoft is very giving on that standpoint. I will tell you that. I haven't heard of anyone that has been turned down except for a few people. And the reason, I have a feeling the reason why a couple of these people were turned down is because one of them actually went through and asked about, a dozen times for this exception. And then Microsoft finally said, you know what? Enough is enough. You're going to have to pay for a higher tier of Azure services because we just can't keep giving you this, on the same tier that you're using. So these are really good things to keep in mind. If you're going to build out infrastructure besides your Citrix infrastructure, or you're going to deploy multiple Citrix infrastructures, these are really good things to keep in mind. All right, so I am going to stop right here and see what questions I got. I've got a couple things going on here. I don't have any questions, but thank you, Mr. Dillinger. I appreciate you being on board here today. For those of you who don't know, we've got, for some reason, quite a few of the CTPs have decided to join today. I'm not exactly sure why, because I'm probably the worst speaker out of everybody who's joined us. But thanks, guys. I really appreciate that. So we're going to take a real quick cruise here through the Azure portal. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until, because I've only got a couple slides on PowerShell, and I'm going to cruise through that, and then we'll hop over to the real stuff. So for those of you, like I said, there's a couple of different ways you can manage Azure. One of them is through the portal, which is a GUI, and some people just they will not give up the GUI. It's something that they it's in their blood. I'm not really sure, but some of us were raised on command line, and like myself, I was raised in a Unix environment, so I'm a command line person. So I use PowerShell, I use Azure CLI. I also use the GUI. I'm flexible that way, but you can use that. You can, PowerShell is the other big one. So in order to do PowerShell, to use it, you need to set up the framework, right? So the framework is the latest 5.5, and then if you're using Windows 10 or Windows 2016, it's like automagic. When it does its updates, it updates PowerShell. PowerShell, those of you who have maybe been living under a rock here for a little while, I don't mean that in a bad way, but PowerShell is now open source. So you can go out to GitHub and you can download even the source code for the scripting engine and be able to do whatever you like with it. Some folks already have. But you can go out and you can update it anytime you want. There's actually a real quick and easy way to do it within PowerShell itself, which I can show you. But it's, I think 6.0 is in beta. So if you wanted to go get this beta, go out to GitHub and grab it. Then you got the PowerShell itself. 3.0 is the minimum. Okay, 5.x obviously is best. Yeah, beta 6 is out there in GitHub. I think, I'm not sure if it's still in beta. I don't know. And then you have the commandlets, all right? These are the things that you need to have. You need to have the Azure downloads, okay? So I'll show you how to get those. That's the actual Azure commandlets. Now there's two sets of those. There's the Azure commandlets, which is for the ASM, and then you have the Azure RM commandlets, which are for the ARM or the Resource Manager, all right? Then you can do that through the Web Platform Installer, the WPI as they call it. You can get it through GitHub. You can get it standalone, or one of my favorites is you can get it directly from Chocolatey. If anybody uses Chocolatey out there, you can download it directly from there. And then to keep current, use PowerShell Get. all right, which is built into PowerShell, the GitHub releases, or the Azure downloads again. Now, there's some things that are built into PowerShell now that when you do, you can go right to the PowerShell gallery and download stuff. I'll show that to you, but you have the ability to update on the fly now, which is really cool. The last thing I will say about PowerShell is PowerShell DSC. For those of you who don't know DSC, if you don't know what it is yet, okay, you really need to learn it. If you're going to be managing some of this stuff, this DSC is desired state configuration. If you really don't understand that, I highly recommend it's something that you should learn, because it's kind of like a way of it goes beyond. Some people just say, well, it's taking PowerShell and being able to template things with PowerShell. It goes way beyond that. I mean, there are so many things you can do at DSC. You can, do automation and orchestration and everything with it. So if you think about it, if you use any orchestration tools right now, Ansible or Puppet or anything like that, PowerShell DSC fits right in there. Okay, so it really, I encourage you to learn that. And the management methods with PowerShell, okay, ASM is built-in access. The ARM requires a config. Okay, and what I mean by management methods, actually, it really should say PowerShell access methods. If you want to use your PowerShell down here, on Earth, if you will, to manage something that's up in the sky, up in the cloud, you really need that security, right? Because unless you've got a direct connection like ExpressRoute or something, it's not secure. So there are different ways you can do that. You can, if you have a direct internet connection, you don't have a VPN, you don't have an express route, you have to create certificates and do all this other kind of stuff. It's really simple if you understand it, and you can go out and you can Google it, and there are many folks that have created step-by-step things on how to do it. But you can also just kind of simplify it. You can go the internal and just create a Windows jump box, which I do a lot. I'll just create a jump box so I can go up there and I can take care of stuff and not have to worry about it. They also have something called the OMI provider, all right? And then I have something on your SMT. SMT doesn't exist anymore, which in my opinion really stinks. I was an advocate of it and gave several presentations on it, and then I really yelled at Microsoft when they got rid of it. But it was an actual server management tools that were up in Azure. They replaced it with something called Project Honolulu, which I'm sure some folks have heard about. The problem with Project Honolulu is it doesn't manage Azure resources. It only manages on premises. So it really kind of stinks that way. I could use stronger words, but I won't. And I just don't understand why Microsoft did that, where the SMT could manage Azure and on-premises resources. So I'm not exactly sure what their thinking is there or what they're doing, but that doesn't exist anymore. And then the external RDP SSH, you can do a WinRM to 5986, which is posh remoting, okay, PowerShell remoting. A really cool person, Sarah Cooley, in Madison and in Seattle, created PowerShell remoting. I got to meet her. She's actually my MVP advisor. Great thing. It really is a cool thing. And then I've got SMT there, so you can just ignore that. All right, let's get to the real stuff. How about that? So we'll get rid of that. Let me see if I got any questions here off the bat. Oh my goodness, I do. Can you give some points and pros and cons on moving Citrix infra to the Azure cloud? Boy, I don't know if I'm the right guy for that. And the reason for that is I think that Marius or Dave, those guys could actually give you a little bit more insight than myself. I've built up in Azure, but I haven't moved. Okay, so I built new up there, but I haven't really migrated anyone because, some of the folks that I've worked with, they were like, you know what, if we're going to do this, we're going to start over and we're going to build it new. And they took the opportunity to redo some stuff and get their security straight and stuff like that. But no, they don't even have a real hybrid solution. They just kind of they built everything up there and then they started moving people there, one by one, and that's where they're at. So I apologize. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. One more here. I work in Azure and manage 16 subs. Okay, others mostly manage the guts itself, devs, etc. And I just learned a few things, so good info, thank you. So I want to expand Citrix there too, good stuff. Question I have is, can the delivery controllers take advantage of failing MCS Azure machines between Azure regions for high availability of the MCS deployed machines? I don't think so yet. I don't know that for sure, but I don't think they can yet. Not between regions. The whole thing with what they call region availability sets is what you're alluding to, and those are brand new. Those just came out at Ignite. They were just announced at Ignite. So I think that's pretty new. Now, I could be wrong. The person that you really need to ask that question to, and I'd be happy to pass it on to him, is Joel Stocker and a couple of his folks at Citrix who actually are in charge of the Citrix Cloud. But I can't answer that truthfully. I apologize. All right. Let's take a look at this thing. So this is what the portal looks like. For anybody who hasn't seen the portal, okay, now this is a customized portal, obviously, because when you first log in and you get a subscription, it's kind of like a kind of a white, you know, with a blue, bright blue, and it's really, I think it's kind of ugly. But you can actually go in and customize it like I did just by going over here and clicking on the settings, you know, and being, excuse me, being able to change your colors and, you know, change the theme. I like the darkness kind of a thing. Do all that kind of cool stuff. All right. So what I want to show you here is, first of all, anybody interested in doing testing or doing like trying out cool stuff, I highly recommend you go to this site. You can just Google it if you want, but it's basically just all the preview features that you can try in Azure, and they don't cost you anything. All right, so it's just something you can go out there and you can say, yeah, I want to try this and give your feedback. A lot of people, you know, just want to try it and don't give their feedback, but I highly encourage you to go out and do that and give your feedback so they can make these things better. A lot of these actually come back as free offerings. Okay, so if you go up for a preview, you say, try it, yeah, I want to hook up with that, go out and do something, then all of a sudden they say, well, it's coming out of preview and it's just going to be an offering that we just give you, okay? A lot of them in here. All right, and when I talk about that in terms of a free offering, there are a couple of different kinds of subscriptions that you can get, right? But I don't know if you knew this, but you can actually sign up now for a free subscription through Azure that actually lasts for 12 months. Okay, and you get certain features available to you for the entire 12 months. But if you're talking about putting your Citrix environment up in Azure and you've already done that, then you obviously have a subscription to do that. And this is not something that you need. But for anybody out there who just wants to play around in Azure, you can get a free subscription now that extends for that long. When I talk about templates, these are the actual Azure Quick Start templates. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of them. If you just want to go out and you want to create a VM with a new AD Forest, okay, you click on that, it comes back, it tells you everything about what this thing does, okay, it gives you a template, command line, all that kind of stuff, but all you have to do is click on Deploy to Azure. You click on Deploy to Azure and it just logs you in, if you're not already logged into the portal, logs you into the portal and says, okay, we're going to do this. Give me all this information, all these parameters, and then I'll just go ahead and deploy it for you. And that's it. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's really cool. Now, some of these will actually have something called a visualizer here. What they call a visualizer button, which is really nice when you start getting into ones that are a little bit more complicated. I don't know if I know where one is here, but if you click on it, it actually brings up a visualized map. Yeah, this one doesn't have it, but it actually brings up a mapping tool called Visualizer that shows you the layouts of everything. So if you had a load balancer in there, it'll show you that, how it's connected back to the VMs, you know, how it's connected to the VNet, all that kind of stuff. It creates a visual mapping, if you will, of what it's going to do, and it's really cool. Now, all of this stuff, okay, as you notice, it says browse on GitHub, and the reason for that is because everything that you see on that page is brought in through GitHub. Microsoft is putting everything out in GitHub. This is all the templates, okay, that you saw on the other page. They're being sucked in and being displayed on that web page. All right, so if you need a traffic manager web app, I don't know why you would, but if you do, you can go out there, click on this, and have it deployed automatically to Azure. Okay, it's that easy. It's really, really cool. These are contributed by the community as well as Microsoft. Okay, you'll notice some of them are kind of dated, 10 months ago, but then there's some that are just 3 years ago. Okay, sorry, three days ago. There's a year ago below it. 3 days ago. So that's where you pick up templates. All right. We also take a look at GitHub. All right, and this is where you pick up the PowerShell. All right, so this is where PowerShell right now is open source. You can go and you can download it. If you go here, it actually tells you what the current version is, and then it tells you what everything it manages. Sorry, I'm going kind of fast here, but it tells you how to install it. All right, and when you get down to the installation inside of PowerShell, all you're doing is basically going out and you're just, doing an install module Azure RM, and it'll, hit enter, and it'll go through and it'll do the install for you. You don't have to do anything. If it was an update, because it's going to come back and tell me I already have it installed, instead of doing install module, just do update module Azure RM or update module Azure. All right, and it'll come back and it'll update it to the latest version. I didn't have it installed in this one. I'm kind of cruising through this. I understand I don't have much time. I've only got about 5 minutes left. I do want to show you the latency tests. AzureSpeed.com gives you, if you're troubleshooting, you're like, man, why is it taking so long to, do my storage? Is it a problem? This will actually give you geography latency tests and what the average latency is based on the location. All right, in a nice graph form. Another one is the Azure Speed Test. The Azure Speed Test will actually give you blob storage latency, all right, which is what Citrix uses. Right now, it's actually not showing me the graph because I've had it up for a little while. But there's a nice little graph here where it tells you what the actual latency is. The best one, though, is something from Cloud Harmony. I don't know if anybody's used Cloud Harmony. It's actually owned by Gartner. If it has anything negative going against it, it's that. No, I'm sorry, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding, Gartner. But they run this called Cloud Harmony. It is really awesome tool to use for any cloud provider. They actually go out and they will test compute, storage, and everything else against all these different cloud providers. Literally, look at all these. There's probably, what, 50 here, if not more, including Azure, AWS, and then all the other CSPs, BlueLock, Cadexis, City Cloud, all these guys, Level 3. You can go out and you can, even Salesforce.com, you can go out and compare and look at what they're actually doing out there in terms of their storage, their DNS resolution, all that kind of stuff, and then even in different regions. This is a great tool for troubleshooting, something, or even researching what is the best thing that I can do here, okay? What's the best cloud provider that I could use? Azure Storage. When you're dealing with Azure Storage, it's something called the Storage Explorer. I highly recommend that if you're going to be looking into storage, trying to troubleshoot storage and manage storage in Azure, this actually gives you like an Explorer type view of storage in Azure. Now, you can use this because it's a separate component. In the portal now, you can actually, there's an option when you go to a storage account, there's an option up on top that says Open in Explorer. So it's kind of like you click on it and it opens the storage up in Azure just like you see it as a drive, inside of Explorer. It's kind of cool, But if you deal with a lot of accounts and a lot of storage, this might be more beneficial for you. All right. Now, I did have one other thing here. Citrix has all this cool stuff that you can do. All right. Obviously, Azure Active Directory. All right. That's something that you definitely want to integrate with your Citrix environment. SCOM to monitor, the Citrix VDAs on Azure. These are definitely articles, if you're interested in that stuff, you definitely want to look at. This one I highly recommend from Marius, actual OMS monitoring, which is, the old SCOM, the SCOM that's up in the cloud, okay, is Microsoft OMS. And he walks through actually how to set it up, how to install it, all that other kind of cool stuff. This is the actual OMS agent that you need to download from Azure for Citrix, all right? But I do recommend possibly looking at this guy, IT Pro Cloud. He created his own agent, okay? And I think it's, pretty comparable, and it's something you might want to look at. So if you are going to do OMS and you do RDS and Citrix, this guy really might be something you want to look at. I think it's kind of cool, and it's free, so why not? I've got 2 minutes left, and I haven't even gotten to the full dashboard. That's my problem. I just try and do too much. One of the things I do want to show you really quick is if you're out there and you're doing, you're putting your Citrix environment up into the cloud, and you're kind of like, going to start over, and you don't know exactly how you're going to do it. The main thing you need to do and understand is that you need to understand how Azure monitors and logs things, okay? So log analytics is really big inside of Azure, all right? And that's one of the things you need to understand. You also need to understand how Active Directory works, because that all ties together, right? If you don't want to put Active Directory, if you don't want to tie your on-premises Active Directory up to Azure, which you can do with a simple little connector, what they call Azure AD Connect, all right? That'll actually take your Azure Active Directory and sync it, your on-premises Active Directory and sync it up to Azure. You can actually create a full domain services up in Azure, okay? So you can create your own domain services. It's like having an AD controller up in, an AD controller service up in Azure. You don't have a physical server, you have the service. So I can go out there and run everything from Azure. I don't even need the on-premises AD domain any longer. All right, people have been waiting a long time for this, and what this does is this allows them to actually move away from having the identity management in their on-premises data centers, if that's what you want. And a lot of people have been looking for that. I have 0 time left, and I thank you very much. I'm looking at the questions. Everybody kind of probably got bored here, but there are no more questions. Stephanie, I will go back here. There we go. And I thank you all very much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And I hope I covered some stuff for you. Again, you can reach me at Nell Media on Twitter, and reach out to Marius or Dave or any of the other CTPs or Citrix people, Joe Harder, Rick Dillinger, Samuel, Jason Samuel, Carl Webster, any of those guys that that deal a lot with the cloud, Eduardo, any of those folks, reach out to them, ask them those questions. You can ping them on the forums. I know Tobias and Carl Stahlhood are really big on the forums. You can ping them as well. And I try and help out as much as I can, but I hope this helped out a little bit, and I thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Stephanie, for allowing me to do this.
Absolutely. I think you're so modest about your speaking style. I think it was great, Mike. It was wonderful. And I just want everyone to know how much we value Mike. He is so helpful with us. Every month we meet and talk about content for the website and for webinars and all the stuff. He provides really great input and has come up with a lot of really good ideas. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Really quickly, I put a couple of links in the chat for you. One is a link to the webinar that Dave Brett and Marius Sambu put on that Mike referenced, so you can find that there. There's also another webinar happening, another user share next Thursday. It's with the networking SIG guys, and it's going to be talking about Citrix Cloud Workspace Solutions in Azure, so you might be interested in that as well. And then finally, there is a survey link in the chat. We always love to get your feedback. It helps us, and our presenters like to hear your thoughts as well. So hope you find all those links useful, and make sure that in addition to following Mike on Twitter, you also follow us at MyCUGC. And I think that'll do it for us today. Hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again, Mike. And and you will receive a link to the recording via email, so be on the lookout for that tomorrow. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.